Good evening. It's 7:03, which I believe is 7 o'clock CMU time. I've watched students for many years coming into class. Welcome. This is our 10th annual Gil and Ruth Fleer Lecture for Values-Based Education. And we're glad that you've come out this evening. Gil and Ruth Fleer can't be with us. They're on limited travel at this time, but they have graciously provided us for this lecture series, and we are, again, into our 10th year, and so hopefully we'll be able to have them access it on YouTube, and they will be able to enjoy tonight's presentation. Well, a decade ago, we began this series when Elder Atum Azahir from Minneapolis came down and showed us how to bring disparate worlds of wisdom together to improve community health services. Her talk was entitled The Power of Engagement, Communities and Philosophies of Knowledge, creating models for community, institutions, and partnerships to improve health. And so we were off to a good start with Elder Atum. The next year, the Reverend Dr. F. Douglas Poe came and gave a talk on the courage to be, which demonstrated the power of personal spirituality and its ability to affect group salvation. There you go. Did we see?
You skipped one.
Oh, there it is. There it is. Thank you. I have their pictures here. All right, and then the next year was the Reverend Wayne Meisel. And Reverend Meisel helped to sow the seeds for what is now our Center for Faith and Service here on the CMU campus. His expertise is in the area of steward leadership and doing faith and service. Dr. Bradley Wright came in 2012, and he gave a talk called Christians Are Hate-Filled Hypocrites and Other Lies That You've Been Told. And this is off a best-selling book that he wrote. He's a University of Connecticut sociologist, and he came and helped show us some of the good news that's sort of hiding behind the trends that we find in human society. The next year, Reverend Rebecca Simon Peter presented Global Weirding, Wacky Weather, the Christian Call to Discipleship in a Changing Climate. And she helped us chart a course of creation care for the 21st century. And CMU alumna Thera Freeman came next, and she presented the miseducation of Thera Freeman, which many misunderstood as a wrongfully guided education here. Rather, it was a more broad look at her introspective personal pilgrimage that she took from student at CMU to seminarian at Duke University to an extended mission trip of 3 years in Central Africa. The Reverend Dr. Stephen Manskar came the next year, answering the simple question, what is a Methodist? Well, he took us back to the roots of Methodism and challenged us with a Wesleyan model for faith and discipleship. Dr. John Wigger from the University of Missouri came and did his talk on religious innovation in American culture, the case of Jim and Tammy Baker and the PTL television empire. This gave us a sort of behind-the-scenes look at fame, fortune, and the rather false ministry of the PTL Club. Last year, 2017, Dr. David Brockman came, and his talk was entitled Educating for Pluralism or Against It, the Struggle Over Religion Coverage in Texas Public Schools. And this was important because he helped to illustrate the far-reaching choices involved in creating curriculum for the very influential Texas textbook market. And finally this year we welcome Reverend Dr. Angela Sims and her talk, Then and Now, Black Bodies, Violence, and Radicalized Rhetoric. And I will now invite Dr. Kevin Carnahan up for a formal introduction.
So I'm Kevin Carnahan. Racism is the founding sin of the United States of America. And it's a sin we seem unable to shake. We have gone through 2 periods of Reconstruction since the Civil War, and yet this summer white supremacists marched in Charlottesville, Virginia, and elsewhere. Police violence involving unarmed people of color led to massive frustration and at times mass uprisings in cities across the nation. And in American politics, racism has become more and more explicit of late. In many ways, it seems that society is moving in the wrong direction. These were the thoughts we had on our minds when the Religion and Philosophy Department sat down to think about this year's Fleer Lecture. Having worked with Angela Sims on the board of the Society of Christian Ethics and being familiar with her work, I suggested we bring her to campus, and I am excited that she accepted our invitation. The Reverend Dr. Angela Sims is an oral historian, a professor, and a womanist theologian. She gained her BA from Trinity University, gained her Master of Divinity from Howard University School of Divinity, and gained her PhD from Union Theological Seminary and Presbyterian School of Christian Education. She has no fewer than 3 different titles at her current job. She is the Vice President of Institutional Advancement. She is the Robert B. and Catherine Rogers Associate Professor in Church and Society. And she is Associate Professor of Ethics and Black Church Studies at St. Paul Seminary in Kansas City. She is the co-author of Religio-Political Narratives in America from Martin Luther King through Jeremiah Wright. She is co-editor of Womanist Theological Ethics, a Reader, and she is author of the book Ethical Complications of Lynching. Her work in oral history has been written up by the New York Times, where she's gone out and collected oral histories of lynching from around the United States. I'm really honored to have the Reverend Dr. Sims with us tonight, and please help me in welcoming her to the podium.
Good evening. I would like to thank Dr. Jeffries and Reverend Dr. Carnahan for their gracious and kind invitation, and for individuals with whom I was graced to have dinner with on this evening. I would also like to thank Ms. Carol Brown for agreeing to display this particular quilt, which maps the 229 documented lynchings in Missouri. And the quilt serves as a visual depiction that Black bodies, violence, and racialized rhetoric remains a moral dilemma with which this country must yet confront. As an introduction to tonight's lecture, I draw your attention to the April 4, 1968 assassination of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr. 50 years on this side of Dr. King's murder, evidence of police brutality and an insurgence of white nationalism serve as poignant reminders that then and now, Black lives in these disunited states of America are seen by many as insignificant. After all, we need only reflect for a brief moment on what I describe as the creating of an icon, void of a thick historical recounting of the manner in which King's very embodiment as a Black man, issues of patriarchy and infidelity aside, was a site for expressions of racially sanctioned hatred, authorized and sanctioned by supposedly law-abiding citizens. 5 decades later, a rallying concern for many non-cisgendered heterosexual white males, or those who can pass as such, is reluctance by one too many residents of this nation whose historical amnesia impedes an ability to grapple with the social analysis that informed Dr. King's dream for a beloved community. All too often, there's a tendency to focus on King's oratorical style at the expense of analyzing the import of his message and its contemporary relevance. Born out of a deep sense of hope in the midst of a reign of terror, what King offered humanity is an antidote to nihilism. It is a hope shaped in the shadow of lynching trees and other symbols used to incite fear and intimidation. From trees on courthouse lawns, to high-pressured water hoses, to police clubs, to dogs, 50 years on this side of King's assassination, it is imperative that we realize that his social, historical, economic insights are antithetical to a rising oligarchy that seeks to disrupt notions of freedom and human decency. Then and now, to remember King is an invitation to engage in intersectional contextual analyses that take seriously the role of symbols in a culture predicated and sustained on violence. As I reflect on King's murder and associated social public commemorations, and I have problems with the issue of commemorating and remembering anniversaries of an assassination. Claude McKay's 1922 poem, The Lynching, reminds me of historical and contemporary religious meaning embedded in the noose. Hear McKay's words. His spirit is smoke ascended to high heaven. His father, by the cruelest way of pain, had bidden him to his bosom once again. The awful sin remained still unforgiven. All night a bright and solitary star, perchance the one that ever guided him, yet gave him up at last to fate's wild whim, hung pitifully o'er the swinging char. Day dawned, and soon the mixed crowds came to view, the ghastly body swinging in the sun. The women thronged to look, but never a one showed sorrow in her eyes of steely blue. And little lads, lynchers that were to be, danced round the dreadful thing in fiendish glee. My research examines race, religion, and violence with a specific attention to ethical, theological implications of lynching in the United States of America. My work emerges from and is influenced deeply by the almost 2 years I devoted to document oral histories of Black elders' memories of a culture that lent itself to such barbaric practices. As such, I am unwavering in my assertion that elders who entrusted an aspect of their memory about lynching and a culture of lynching with me represent what Cornel West describes as Black prophetic practices. Each contributor has a story to tell about life in the U.S. that disrupts a carefully crafted version of truth, particularly a national narrative of equality premised on a myth that everyone is in pursuit of an ambiguous, monolithic dream. Even if unconsciously aware of an association of power and rhetoric, remembering lynching oral history participants use language symbolically to describe their understanding of self in relation to others. Their reflections convey an understanding of human dynamics that often stand in tension with a basic Christian tenet that all people are created in God's image. Thus, to give voice to dimensions of race as a polarizing religious factor necessitates a re-examination of a universal concept of the Imago Dei. Despite verbal declarations of love of God and love of all humanity, socio-historical evidence suggests that encounters by Blacks with proponents of lynching and a culture of lynching provide accurate depictions of individuals' relationship with the divine. This realization of an embodied theology that situates expressions of the divine in diverse sites of worship from beyond the confines of a church house to the foot of a lynching tree contradicts notions of a society premised on law and order. When it comes to lynching and a culture of lynching, we must ask ourselves how our response to various expressions of resistance is informed by a culture of terror from which, to varying degrees, only a select few may be exempt. McKay's poem, as does Carol Brown's quilt, illustrates just how difficult or uncomfortable it is to hear, to sit with, and to process lynching stories. Since there is no easy way to talk about lynching as a historical contemporary dimension of life in this country, I offer as one example of a shared national narrative an excerpt from Mrs. Catherine Louise Clark Fletcher's oral history. Born in Denver, Colorado, and orphaned at the age of 9, Fletcher was adopted a year later by Evelyn and Leon Toomer of St. Joseph, Missouri. She considered this town her home until 1939-1940, when she graduated from West Virginia State College and began to work for the federal government in Washington, D.C. To contextualize her memory of lynching and a culture of lynching, Fletcher provides this account of a lynching that occurred in St. Joseph, which is about 50 miles north of Kansas City, during her initial year as a Missouri resident.
This was the first year I had gone to St. Joseph, and I was in the 5th grade. And this big boy was a lot larger than most of the children in that class, but very kind. And the word got around that I was an orphan. I don't know why children have to be identified as orphans than they are. And he felt sorry for me. So he was kind to me. I remember one day he brought me they had big suckers that were caramel, like called Holloway. And one day he brought one to school after noon and slipped it to me. But he was just a nice, if there was trouble on the playground, he was the one to break it up. But he was the first child I had ever seen who could not read. And I felt sorry for him because he couldn't read. He was different. But there was a young woman who supposedly had gone to a movie downtown. She lived on one of the main streets where the streetcar, where she had access to the streetcar. The woman would get off almost in front of her home. According to her, when she came home from the movie, she was attacked by a boy, two boys. And of course she said that they were both Negroes. And she wasn't raped, she said that she was attacked. She was late getting home. But when she tells where this attack took place, she said a shortcut through an alley. But the alley was really out of the way for her to have been there. It was generally accepted in the black community that she was just making up a story because she was late getting home. These two boys were school dropouts, and so they picked them up and put them in jail. And no questioning, just, you two, you're in trouble. And they had been involved in some petty thievery, that kind of thing. The next day, some local people began gathering at the jail, man. By that evening, quite a group of people had gathered at the jail. And things were going fairly well until some of the farmers from outside of St. Joseph and from Kansas came over. And this is when the trouble started. A black lawyer in town, got in touch with the governor to tell him he expected trouble and asked for help. We think that the governor perhaps didn't think it was that serious and delayed sending in help. And this is mostly from the outsiders who caused it who stirred up the group. And they asked the sheriff for Lloyd, for that. They didn't have a name for the man. And at first he refused to give them anyone, and until they threatened to break the door down. Now, in the one account says that they did, but according to those who seem to know their religion, they say the door wasn't open, but the threat was great because they had gotten a big beam to knock the door down. And so the sheriff went down, and he just decided, he had these two boys, but he just started Lloyd and took him up and handed him to the mob. According to one person, Lloyd was stabbed in the back so soon after he came up. I'm hoping this is what happened to him, because they chained him to the back of a car and after brutalizing him some there to jail, and they dragged him through the black community, the streets of the black community, calling all kinds of obscene things, and then took him back to the jail. And by this time, I rather think he may have been dead. The general idea was that he was dead by this time. And they hanged him to the tree on the courthouse lawn. They in the book it says near the across from the Ruby Doo Hotel, which is an outstanding hotel, but this is on the courthouse lawn, and set a fire, built a fire under his body. You think that he was dead, and I hope to God that he was dead. And just set fire on it. Some of the kids who had been to a basketball game at the black school, high school, came along not knowing that this was taking place, and just saw the crowd, and of course curiously, to see what was going on. One said that the body was stomach was so distended, this type of person, and such are falling on the ground. Someone in the crowd saw them and said, "Here's some niggers," and of course they took off. I was at a girl reserve, it was called Girl, now it's White Teens, Girl Reserve meeting at the White WCA across town that evening, and that afternoon. My mother called to tell them that there was trouble downtown, to send all of the girls home, and anyone who had to come that way, past the courthouse, to give them bus or streetcar fare so that they wouldn't have to walk. And of course, in those days, you didn't question your parents, you just did what they said. So I took transportation home. When I got home, of course, the dragging of the fire and all that had taken place. And my parents were in our house with the shades on and the lights out. My mother was from Texas, my father was from Alabama. These are adopted parents, and my father from Alabama. This is the first time I had seen terror in their faces. And my mother would walk into a buzzsaw. But she was and that enlightened me. She was really enlightening. But I realized, I didn't think at that time, hey, they've come from a part of the country where this is rather commonplace. And they know how serious this can be. So we sat there in the house with the lights out and shades on the rest of the night, really. And the next day, of course, there was all this buzz about what had taken place, and Lloyd was dead. It affected me in a horrible way. I was so full of anger and hate. Oh, I hated. I had to get out that day to go someplace, and I hated every white face I saw. Oh, I was so full of anger and hate. And unfortunately, I didn't talk to anybody about this. I think it would have helped if I had talked about it. But I just, after a while, kind of buried this. I was going to college. Of course, in college, you're in such an artificial environment. So I think I just buried this hate and anger for a number of years.
This excerpt from Fletcher's narrative suggests that, at its best, history is always an incomplete record. My research illustrates how oral histories invite and maybe even demand that religious scholars examine and assign value to non-scribal sources. Oral histories are repositories from which to reframe theological questions. As primary texts, my oral histories compel me to examine key issues and ethical problems that may not be addressed from multiple perspectives in accepted canonical sources. At some level, though, these narratives signify that the proverbial maxim, treat others the way in which we want to be treated, continues ultimately to shift responsibility for life-affirming human interaction to persons who are often targeted for systematic destruction. This stance can and perhaps should raise questions about behavioral patterns that are so intricately woven into the fiber of this country's sense of entitlement that it allows one too many citizens to become anesthetized to practices that, if observed in other contexts, would be characterized as barbaric. Contrast, for example, reactions to activists from Parkland, Florida, in response to the February 14, 2018 massacre at Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School, against reactions to activists who gathered in Ferguson, Missouri, to protest specifically the August 9, 2014 shooting of Michael Brown, and more broadly, the killing of unarmed Black persons in the U.S. In some regards, our unarticulated comparisons suggest we take seriously words penned in honor of 1960 civil rights leader Ella Baker, reflected on Baker's life work in general and the murder of 3 young men during Freedom Summer, a 1964 voter registration project in Mississippi, supported by college students and veteran civil rights workers. Bernice Johnson Reagan's Ella song invites us to consider that, and I quote, "We who believe in freedom cannot rest until it comes," close quote. More specifically, Reagan insists that, and I quote, "until the killing of white men, white mothers' sons, is as important as the killing of Black men, Black mothers' sons, we who believe in freedom cannot rest, we cannot rest until it comes," close quote. The murder of 21-year-old Black Mississippian James Chaney in 1964. The 20-year-old New Yorker Andrew Goodman, and 24-year-old New Yorker Michael Schwerner. Killings of unarmed persons of African descent and sites of domestic terrorism in this country inform our understanding of the religious significance of Black bodies, violence, and racialized rhetoric. To ponder on these things is to take seriously the necessary and difficult work that is required to dispel ignorance that is so deeply entrenched into systems and processes. Most accounts, sadly, of domestic terrorism in this occupied territory that is our nation fail to address moral injuries that have long-term residual implications for victims, perpetrators, witnesses, and all with whom they are associated. To follow this line of thinking, it is possible that I could make a claim that to evaluate strategies employed by diasporic persons of African descent who live in this country and persons who stand in solidarity with us is to engage in a process by which we glean insight into ways in which a particular generation navigated mob rule and national horrors that may challenge assumptions about civility. To come of age in varied shades of Blackness in the late 19th and early 20th centuries symbolized to many Blacks who remember lynching that civility must always be informed by an analysis of this nation's complicated and tortured fascination with terror. Unlike the Jewish Holocaust that has international recognition, lynching continues to be associated with shame and denial. Shame embodied by one too many who lived under this regime of terror, and denial by one too many who refute evidence preserved on postcards and other visual depictions. Because of lingering, though often unacknowledged residual effects, lynching memories offer a different lens through which to evaluate personal and communal values. As such, dialogues on and about lynching cannot and should not be ignored. Participants in my oral history project, who resided in various sectors of the United States, add depth to existing historical, sociological, and theological contributions on this difficult topic. Retired educators like Mrs. Fletcher, clergy, scientists, veterans, entrepreneurs, lawyers, and day laborers discuss lynching because for them, historical remembrance is a theological, ethical mandate. Whether they acquire the equivalent of a first-grade education or achieve the highest degree in their field, lynching narratives, when viewed as oral epistles, challenge me to reassess notions of courage and the sacred. From recollections of aborted lynchings and strategies of survival, Blacks who remember lynching invite me to consider how their stories, shaped and still unfolding in the shadow of lynching trees, influence what constitutes truth. Although blood or the threat of blood is etched forever in the recesses of the minds of many Blacks who came of age in the U.S. during a period marked by lynching, their social historical recollections can function as points of entry. Entry points to provide the human community another frame of reference from which to examine diverse ways in which notions of civility frame narratives that offer insights about these individuals' human capacity to make a conscious decision to go into their interior archives and determine for themselves if or how they will give voice to a truth that reflects their lived reality. While I will never know fully the effect of lynching, oral historical accounts can function as a basis from which to evaluate strategies of resistance and visions of justice from which to construct an ethic of resilience. As I weigh benefits associated with an excavation of truths embedded and embodied in the minds and souls of Black elders, it is imperative for me to acknowledge that courage, civility in our age, is connected intricately to notions of justice as persons look back to times past and reflect on current situations as a mirror by which to assess how truth-telling might inform a national response to hate-infused rhetoric employed to perpetuate a culture of fear. A review of elders' vivid responses to culturally embedded and present-day responses to terror suggests, to borrow from Frederick Douglass's 1894 speech, which he delivered at Metropolitan African Methodist Episcopal Church in Washington, D.C., that there are lessons of the hour that continue to merit serious consideration. A particular concern for many oral history participants is how a lack of knowledge of U.S. history by a large percentage of a post-1960 civil rights generation, especially its citizens of African descent, contributes to a reenactment of a culture of lynching with persons ill-equipped to assess the import of cries to make America great again, premised on a notion of exceptionalism couched in simplistic religious jargon. Embedded in this nationalist-like language is a disavowal of human rights that at its most fundamental level is predicated upon a perpetuation of mythological notions of privilege that often prohibit a forging of alliances across class lines. After all, some persons are so steeped in a false sense of racial entitlement, they choose to participate willingly in perpetuating stereotypical myths rather than engage in difficult but necessary dialogue from which actions to further a more just society might emerge. I contend that it is virtually impossible to think about the contributions of Black elders whose oral narratives inform notions of courageous truth-telling without also recognizing that they, like their contemporaries who chose not to verbalize their experiences with and about lynching, probably recognize a correlation between memory extraction and training in detecting and diffusing improvised explosive devices. It is this knowledge of imminent danger that will, more than likely, inform an internal assessment from which persons who live with a historical reality that contradicts notions of human civility determine whether or how their truth-telling may further the common good. In this regard, courage is not an abstract trait. Courage is rather a contextualized response informed by an understanding of self that seeks to actualize a prophetic mandate to do justice, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with God. Thus, courage is a reasoned decision neither to advance a conspiracy of silence to promote miseducation, nor to condone racial hatred. Courage is a virtue that demands that I acknowledge that truth, a way of knowing that is intricately connected to my own lived reality, that when detonated, when given voice and space, truth can have far-reaching consequences. Courage that calculates cost associated with danger and imagines creative, safe, and liberating movements. Whether memories of lynching and a culture of lynching are preserved for future generations is contingent on a number of factors. For some Blacks, documenting these narratives is indeed, as I mentioned earlier, an ethical mandate. Yet, to ascribe normative status to this position devalues conscious decisions to remain silent, not as an act of cowardice or historical complicity, but rather as an act of agency to preserve one's own sense of well-being. As a non-participant in Sumter, South Carolina mentioned, consideration must always be given to possible repercussions associated with truth-telling. As this gentleman pointed out, to talk is also to live with possible consequences associated with sharing memories which could result in confronting a non-law-abiding past that is fraught with ambiguity and sentencing disparities. On the other hand, as one contributor stated, and I quote, "When I talk about it now and I think about it, I really have a lot of anxiety about that," close quote. Whether individuals share their memories of lynching or not, each, through a process of internal assessment, signals that courage and truth are not abstract ideas. Neither are these moral virtues grounded in notions of absolutism. Rather, remembering lynching narratives compel me to reflect upon lynching, to borrow from Dr. Emily Towns, as a legitimate cultural production of evil. Given this historical reality, courage and truth cannot be comprehended fully without a further explication of the role and function of symbols, tools used strategically to intimidate and restrict activity. From persons who engage in thick interior explorations, I glean additional insights about processes employed to recall traumatic events in such a manner that they do no or at least minimum harm to themselves or to others. Also, when the very act of lynching and its primary weapon, the noose, are internalized to ensure a silencing of history, Blacks who came of age during this death-dealing era offer insights into moral discernment that afford me another point of reference from which to examine the impact of sustained invisible wounds. Because I am compelled to examine intersections of faith, race, and violence, it is also not surprising that I continue to gain a greater appreciation for persons whose lived experiences are antithetical to historical revisionary accounts proposed by some elected officials and educators. When employed as primary resources, these oral histories are further evidence that regardless of religious orientation, there are strategies of resistance and visions of justice that emerge from a culture designed to thwart a sense of human dignity that is of immense significance in a global capitalist society. Life in the shadow of a noose is fraught with ambiguous tension. On the one hand, it is a reality complicated by traditions and compounded by a desire to give voice to practices that reflect the worst of human nature. On the other hand, this state of existence seeks to honor that which contributes to the well-being of all to be co-participants in God's unfolding community. As they recall personal accounts and stories that history books didn't talk about, Blacks who remember lynching share life-preserving insights on ways in which they navigated landmines designed to infuse them with hatred. This astute awareness allowed many not to succumb to build up hate, characterized by some as a process of personal healing that resulted in them being able to put that hate down. Over time, they chose to engage in a de-internalization process that enabled them to name lynching as a byproduct of racism, which is nothing more than systemic sin, cloaked in language that is used adroitly to manipulate a desired response. For Blacks who lived through and now live with memories of a culture characterized by lynching, to remember is to give voice in their own words about a time when they, and I quote, lived in America, the land of the free, but yet there was not freedom. There was a fear. That was the way they did things. The threat was great. You never knew when or where. Everyone talked in hushed tones about it. It was just something that happened, close quote. From persons who remember today, just like it was yesterday, I receive nuggets of wisdom that call into question notions of a beloved community that are compromised when privilege, in its various manifestations, condones behavior by individuals who are, and I quote, not bound by any of the rules that went on there, close quote. In these narratives, accounts of courage embodied by people who, for example, though still Black in a small white town, compel me to become a more informed citizen. Otherwise, I risk being ill-prepared to identify and navigate camouflaged, improvised explosive devices, disguised, for instance, as economic policies, school choice proposals, and immigration directives, to name a few, that seek to disrupt my mental, emotional, cultural constructions which shape an understanding of that which is ultimately just. Even if trees no longer bear strange fruit, a proliferation of stand-your-ground legislation in multiple states, and racial disparities within the U.S.'s incarceration system suggests that blacks remain in the shadow of lynching trees. Individually and collectively, there is a moral responsibility to respond in an informed manner if injustice is to be named and confronted wherever it surfaces. Very much aware of a growing movement to erode human rights in this country, Reverend Wallace Hartsfield Sr., Pastor Emeritus of Metropolitan Missionary Baptist Church in Kansas City, Missouri, insists that Christians must confront the horrific symbolism associated with the cultural practice of domestic terrorism that was often sanctioned, enforced, and executed by governmental officials if the church is to move from a place of accommodation to a place of prophetic agency in an increasingly globalized society. For Hartsfield and countless others, a silent church is a complicit church. In its refusal to be a voice that proclaims consistently a word of truth, the church chooses, for various reasons, to condone injustice. In a world where slavery masquerades as human trafficking and lynching is disguised as the use of deadly force to repel an attack, coupled with subsequent criminal and civil immunity, a historically and socially conscious church must engage in courageous truth-telling. Because of this, conversations about lynching are not designed to foster popularity. Rather, these conversations are strategic opportunities to provide relevant information about cultural symbols and their embedded meanings. Even those symbols most commonly associated with lynching, the rope and bundle sticks that fueled human bonfires, are not displayed visibly, the church is still called to remember that lynching functioned and continues to operate as a metaphor to elicit a desired response. When the church embraces and embodies its prophetic mandate to speak life, it does so fully aware that risk always accompany a decision to confront systems of injustice. In communities across the United States, individuals born in or prior to 1928 have a specific account of and about lynching that needs to be preserved. Some will remember persons whom they knew who died at the hands of persons unknown. Others who survived an aborted lynching may reveal unlikely persons who aided in their rescue. There are others who talk about lynching trees in their respective communities and discuss techniques they employed so as not to become paralyzed by fear of the unknown yet possible. With rare exceptions, blacks who remember lynching offer remarkable insights about a human capacity to forgive without forgetting, to survive and even thrive in the midst of unimaginable evil. When black elders talk about lynching, they convey a powerful message that illustrates their adroitness to navigate within a country that is simultaneously home and alien. When black people testify about an experience of exile in a nation that self-promotes as the epitome of democracy, they signal to countless generations, now and to come, that Christians have a moral responsibility to learn how to sing the songs of the Lord while in a foreign land where increasingly black life is expendable. The religious significance of black bodies, violence, and racialized rhetoric is something that citizens, particularly persons who self-identify as Christian, must address in this post-11/9 society. In this age of Trump, may we purpose to embody that which is ultimately good and just. Like these bearers of history, may we never forget inhumane practices and strategies employed by many to counter that which for many blacks depended on their ability to excavate philosophical truths embedded in their lived reality. From this intentional engagement that informed life-affirming interpretations of their sacred texts, black elders fashioned traditions in the shadow of lynching trees that may one day enable all of us to divest ourselves of oppressive behaviors. If lynching narratives, when told from the perspective of blacks, provide another aspect about a shared existence in this country, the time to preserve these memories is now. Given an almost constant reminder that there are some in high places who seek to normalize alternative facts, when lying is touted as a virtue, documenting truths embedded in the memories of black elders is an essential task that must be prioritized. The time is now. We cannot afford to wait. Or in the words of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., penned as he sat in a cell at the Birmingham, Alabama jail, but when you have seen vicious mobs lynch your mothers and fathers at will, and drown your sisters and brothers at whim, when you have seen hate-filled policemen curse, kick, and even kill your black brothers and sisters, when you are harried by day and haunted by night, by the fact that you are a Negro, living constantly at tiptoe stance, never quite knowing what to expect next, and are plagued with inner fears and outer resentments, when you are forever fighting a degenerating sense of nobodiness, then you will understand why we find it difficult to wait. I will take your questions.
So, listening to a lynching narrative as a white person, right? It seems to me that there's a couple probable immediate reactions. One is a feeling of guilt or shame. Kind of, you mentioned the shame involved. The other possibility being, well, that doesn't really have to do with me. It wasn't me that was involved. It wasn't this. And I think that oftentimes when discussing race and racism, that these are two reactions that I see, where the outcome of it is I'll just keep my head down and either just feel bad about it or keep my head down because I don't want to say anything about my own position. What would you say to a person looking for strategies for listening in a more productive way to these narratives?
So let me sort of nuance your statements.
Yeah.
Because what I hear you asking me is, how do white people do that?
Yeah, okay.
Okay? So part of the issue is that when we talk about race, there is almost an understanding that white is outside of race. White is a-racial. So what I suggest is that we have to also problematize race a little bit more. And we have to talk about whiteness and the production of whiteness and the racialization of all people. And if we can do that, then we're able to come to the table to perhaps to hear. The other thing is cultivating an ability to hear without feeling a need to respond, but to simply hear and to hold what's being held, and then to begin to learn how to process it. The other thing is that I would suggest that it's the way in which we tell stories and the way in which we hear the stories that are being told. So I shared at dinner earlier today that I have a colleague who is on faculty at Loyola University in New Orleans, who is doing similar work in oral history with the children who sat at the base of the lynching trees. And what might it mean at some point to be able to place the oral histories of now aged white elders and aged black elders in conversation with each other. We also have to be mindful that when talking about race, there are no prescriptive answers or prescriptive approaches. And one of the things I allude to in this talk tonight are some of the surprises about how individuals might have been instrumental in helping a black youth actually escape not one lynching but two lynchings. And for this young black boy's family to realize that the only way this young man's father's employer could show up at their house and give them a warning is because that man was the grand wizard of the Ku Klux Klan in their Alabama county. We never know how people masquerade, and we never know how people live dual lives. And so at some point, we have to ask ourselves, how might hearing a narrative be part of a process of redemption for all of us?
Dr. Sims, what's your recommendation for a solution? Where do we go from here?
I think you go a couple of places. Number one, we have to be willing to hear each other. And my premise is that lynching culture is still part of the DNA in this nation. And so we have to be able to name accurately what we see, what we hear, what we experience. And we have to be open to not negating what someone else sees, hears, and experiences. It doesn't mean that we accept everything, but it means we first of all have to be able to hear. and then to craft a question to ask for clarity. But it starts with the conversation and being able to name things. I also think we need to do a better job of researching and knowing history. We live in an era where too many people are becoming extremely comfortable with 180 characters and not being willing to read and to read closely and to ask the questions. We also live in an age where individuals want answers but don't want to wrestle with the questions. And I don't know that there are a lot of answers, but I do know that there are a lot of questions. And if we would open ourselves up to ask and to follow the questions and to see where the questions lead, we might not only discover something about ourselves, but we may discover something about someone else that will be insightful to better understanding ourselves.
Who are key stakeholders that you would invite to the table for this conversation?
I would start with anyone who's in your family. I would also start with asking them to invite individuals who are paid to protect and serve. I would ask them to invite clergy of varying religious affiliations. I would invite them to invite people of no faith to the table. I'd also ask them to think about individuals who have not only been subjected to terror, but who have survived that terror and come out not with a sense of nihilism, but with a sense of hope. There are a lot of co-eds in the room tonight. How do you all listen to what you're bombarded with on a day-to-day basis? And how are you processing what you hear? How do you sift through all of the bits of, and I call them talking pundits. I think we have very few research journalists left in American society. So as you're bombarded with media pundits almost 24/7, how are you processing what you hear? And what are your historical connections to what you're hearing?
Good question. Lane, you're bombarded all the time. What do you think?
About like how we handle like media, like on Twitter, Facebook, all the
Any mediums.
It's hard to really. I mean, even with the last election cycle, you know, it's the first one I was able to vote in, and just all the information that came out of that. Deciding what's real, what's not real, what should be taken for as like with substance and what should not. It's very difficult to do. I think you've got to read very carefully and think very logically about could this really be true, or is there a way that it's not? So, you just got to really sift through it and decide for yourself what's true and what's not true. Because there's so much that you just can't.
I saw your hand.
I think the biggest thing that I've seen on social media is very close-minded people. So I think the number one thing people have to do when going on social media and reading those things is to make sure you're going in with an open mind rather than going with how you feel automatically and not accepting people's opinions in general.
I feel like a lot of it has to do with your morals and your values, what you do interpret, what you do take out of the information that you see on social media or on the news today, and just how your upbringing helps with a lot of it. If you got a good upbringing and you're morally divided, then you're also likely to be able to figure out what you believe in, what you think is true, and what suits your needs at the moment, and just kind of figure out what is right, what is wrong from your own standpoint.
I'm going to push your statement just a little bit further. In thinking about what suits your needs, how do your morals, values, and upbringing also inform the way you think about how your needs are also, in some ways, intricately connected to the needs of others?
Well, if like there's a need for, we'll use like world hunger, for example. I mean, your values and your morals and how your upbringing should tell you that that needs to be ended, and that would suit the needs of the other people, as well as your own, suit your values.
I feel like personally, like when I get on social media and stuff like that, I feel like people just hide behind like their characters of like, it's hard to not react to certain things you see online and stuff like that. And so that's why I don't like to get on it a lot. But when I do be on it, I see just like a lot of hatred, a lot of people speaking their opinion, stuff they wouldn't say in person. You know what I'm saying? And it's like I personally don't get on social media and say something I wouldn't say to somebody's face. Or, you know what I'm saying? Or just if I wouldn't say it in a public setting like this, then I wouldn't say it on Twitter or Instagram or nothing like that. So I feel like a lot of people hide behind what they say on Twitter. And I feel like a lot of people will say one thing and then, you know what I'm saying? It's not just a race thing, it's just in general, you know what I'm saying?
So when social media becomes a platform for bullying.
Yeah, exactly.
How many of you in your middle school, high school, college courses did any reading or research about lynching in the U.S.? Anybody take 8th grade U.S. history? Nothing about lynching in your 8th grade U.S. history classes? A little bit. So when we think about moral issues, as college students, think about the ways in which you really are responsible in a significant way for your own education. That your professors can only introduce you to just a snapshot of something. So think about the ways in which you approach your reading and whether you're just doing the bare minimum or whether you're really taking the time to not only read the required text, but you're reading the supplemental text and the suggested text. Because in order to be prepared to engage in this process of moral discernment on any issue, whether it's lynching or cyberbullying, you've got to be able to know where to go for multiple perspectives in order to determine where you stand on an issue and the evidence that you will use to support your stance. When it comes to history in the U.S., always remember that the victors control the text. So find the voices of those who were not seen as victors and unearth their stories. So whether it's lynching or any other moral issue, understand that the story is typically told from the perspective of the one who has the greatest amount of privilege and access. Thank you for your time on this evening. I've enjoyed being here with you.
Thank you very much for joining us this evening. If you're here for some extra credit and missed the sign-up sheets over on the side, make sure you do that. Also, don't miss out on the cookies next door and an opportunity maybe to have some informal conversation with our guests. Otherwise, the cookies go up to our office area and
So skip the cookies.
skip the cookies, have a conversation here. But otherwise, thank you for coming.